Hey guys and girls, welcome back. We are looking at life in the English colonies today. Last section of chapter 4, and it is chapter 4, section 5 to be exact. We are titled Life in the Colonies. What would life have been like if you lived in the colonies in the early period, in the early 1700s and in the early uh, part of our continent's history before we were actually declared and won our independence, but in the period of time when we were truly 13 colonies and under the authority of England, what would life have been like? The vocab terms that we're going to look at today are indentured servant. Indentured servant was a person who signed a contract to work without pay for 4 to 7 years for anyone who would pay his or her ocean passage to the Americas. So an indentured servant in regular description would be someone who basically did not have the money to come to North America on their own and basically agreed to have someone pay their way, and in exchange for their trip to North America, that person would owe 4 to 7 years labor to the person who paid their voyage. They were not slaves, but they did owe for their labor. And when their term of servitude was up, typically they could become free to do whatever they wanted to do in terms of work or career or what have you. But indentured servants were a person who basically were paying off their debt in North America for a voyage for the payment of their passage to the Americas. And there would be both black and white indentured servants in the early days of our nation's history, both black and white. The next term is enlightenment. Enlightenment is a movement based on belief in reason and in the scientific method. Enlightenment, we're talking about a period that is based where there was a huge belief in both the application of reason and in the application of the scientific method. So two terms, both of these terms and others for this section can be found on Quizlet. We'll take a look at the reading next. So looking at the left-hand side of our worksheets today, as in England, societies in the colonies were divided into classes. Members of the rich gentry and prosperous middle class had more rights and privileges than indentured servants or slaves. In addition, white men had more rights than women or African Americans. We learned that in our reading and our section on chapter 4, section 4, when we talked about the roots of self-government, when we saw who could vote in the colonies. Clearly, white males had more rights than women or African Americans. Yet by the mid-1700s, the colonies had developed a culture different from that of England. Inspired by the Enlightenment, ideas about reason, science, and democracy became part of this new culture in the Americas. One factor that contributed to the growth of democratic ideas was a religious movement known as the Great Awakening. And this movement spread throughout the colonies. This Great Awakening spread throughout the colonies in the 1730s and in the 1740s. Preachers urged people to obey the teachings in the Bible and to repent their sins. In other words, repent sins means to ask forgiveness for their sins. And the Great Awakening caused the creation of many new churches in colonial America. So the Great Awakening, this very, very important religious movement, which swept the 13 colonies. Education was another tradition that grew stronger in the colonies. Different colonies developed different systems of education. As we'll see below, and when we look at our chart, we're going to see that there were different types of schools in the three different groups of colonies. New ideas in science and philosophy affected merchants, lawyers, ministers, and the better educated people in the colonies. And one of the best examples of this Enlightenment spirit, one of the best examples of this idea of people who were both inspired by and contributed to this growth in reason and the application of science, probably the most important American example of the Enlightenment would be Benjamin Franklin. Okay, Benjamin Franklin studied literature, mathematics, and foreign languages. And on top of that, he was an inventor who invented a lightning rod, a smokeless fireplace, and bifocal lenses, of which I'm very thankful for because I wear a set of bifocal lenses. So Benjamin Franklin, we're going to talk about him in class. He represented the spirit of this Enlightenment, this period of knowledge and reason and the application of science, all important parts of the Enlightenment. Let's take it to the questions at the bottom. Before we look at the actual questions, let's also just look at the chart here real quick. You've got the title of the chart, Education in the Colonies, and it breaks it down by region, the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, the Southern colonies, and another one is added for the New England colonies, and the method of education that would have existed typically in each of the three groups of colonies. In the New England colonies, for example, you had the method of education was public schools supported by taxes, and normally you would have boys attend those schools. In the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey, you would have private schools typically would be the method of education. And the only people that really attended schools in the wealthy middle colonies or in the middle colonies would be children of wealthy families, especially sons of wealthy families. In the southern colonies, there was a different emphasis placed on education because it was a largely agricultural economy. Most people were educated were sons of wealthy planters, only the sons of wealthy planters, and they were typically educated at home or at schools in England. Okay, the sons of wealthy planters might be tutored at home in their own homes, or they might be sent back to England to schools across in England. And lastly, you've got the New England colonies who ran an educational system called dame schools, and dame schools were typically schools that were set aside to teach young girls skills that would make them acceptable for married life, skills that might make them acceptable for life as a homemaker or as a mother. So schooling really was not applicable. It was applicable. Schooling was not really geared at young girls. Most of the formal schooling was done in the colonies for boys, and the informal schooling or these dame schools were done typically for girls that would teach them skills that they would need in either married life or in some type of service profession. Okay, so there is our chart on education in the colonies and who was educated and how they were educated. Let's look at our two questions at the bottom of the reading. First question is, what was the Great Awakening? What was the Great Awakening? Again, the first question you're going to answer by using the reading. You're going to answer by using the reading. So look over your reading and answer question 1. And when you are done with that, you can move on to question 2. Question 2 is asking you, related to the chart, describe the type of education found in the southern colonies. For that question, you're going to specifically use the chart. Okay? You're going to specifically use the chart. And when we return in our next lesson, we'll start looking at chapter 5. And when we start looking at chapter 5, we're going to be talking about a crisis. Da, da, da. We're going to be looking at a crisis in the colonies. And we'll talk about what a crisis is when we come back for our next lesson. Crisis in the colonies starting in chapter 5.